Yes, I won the Mega Sena lottery. And no, it didn't cure what I'd been carrying for years. That's how I learned that no amount of money comes before the history we've already lived. It was New Year's Eve. That familiar atmosphere. People talking about plans, promises, new beginnings. Lines at the lottery shop, nervous laughter, numbers chosen with faith, superstition, or desperation. I played too, not because I believed in it, but almost out of habit. A simple bet, made without thinking too much. Like saying, what if? I didn't make plans. I didn't dream big. I didn't imagine a new house, a trip, a brand new car. I just handed the slip of paper to the counter and went on with my life, certain that nothing was going to change. When the results came out, I wasn't even watching. I found out by chance. A stray message, a casual comment, a neighbor shouting in the street. My number was there. While the world started rushing around phone calls, shouts, hugs, people saying your life has just begun, I stood still. Literally still. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't celebrate. I froze. Because, amidst all that noise, one thing became very clear to me. My story didn't begin there. Everyone thought that money would transform me, that I had just been reborn, that from that day on, everything would make sense. But I knew with a certainty that didn't come from reason. It came from the body. The woman who won the Mega Sena lottery was the same one who had spent her life counting pennies. She was the same one who felt guilty when buying something for herself. She was the same one who slept soundly, afraid of running out of money the next day. The prize has arrived, but the scar came with it. And in that first moment, while everyone was celebrating my luck, I understood something that no one there was prepared to hear. The money had changed a bank account, but it still hadn't touched the most wounded part of me. Before the prize, before the winning number, before anyone called me lucky, there was a woman who learned too early to live with fear. And it wasn't big, dramatic, movie-like fear. It was that small, daily fear that sits at the table with you, that sleeps beside you. That's part of the simplest decisions. I grew up in a house where money was never a light subject, not because there was always a shortage, but because there was never an abundance. Everything was accounted for. Everything was measured. Everything had consequences. I learned as a child that asking for something extra meant being a burden, that wanting something could be seen as excessive. That comfort was a luxury, and that luxury didn't suit people like us. My childhood was made of silent promises. Promises I made to myself while watching the adults do what they could. When I grow up, this won't happen. When I can, it will be different. But time passed, and the difference never came the way I imagined. I started working early. I accepted whatever came my way. I was never too picky, because being too picky to me always seemed dangerous. Those who are too picky risk losing everything. Adulthood arrived with responsibilities before it brought security. Bills, commitments, decisions, always with that feeling that any misstep could take me back to square one. I wasn't living in debt, but I was always on edge. Over time, I learned to survive with dignity, and that became a source of pride. She's strong. She can handle it. She doesn't complain. And it was true. I could handle it. But being able to handle it isn't the same as living in peace. Even when things improved a little, the fear didn't go away. It just changed its clothes. It turned into caution. It turned into excessive frugality. It turned into guilt when spending. It turned into that strange feeling that if something was too good to be true, something bad was about to happen. I never knew how to spend money without thinking about the consequences. I never knew how to buy something just because I wanted to. I always needed to justify it. I always needed to be sure I wasn't making a mistake. Material poverty faded into the past, but emotional poverty remained. It manifested itself in the little things, in the difficulty of resting, in the discomfort of receiving something expensive, in the feeling of not deserving comfort, as if suffering had become my identity, as if living without hardship was betraying who I was. I saw people living more lightly and thought, that's not for me. Not out of envy, but because of an invisible limitation I had created for myself. When someone said enjoy, I froze. When someone said relax, my body didn't understand. My body was trained to resist, not to enjoy. And that's how I arrived at the day of the bet. Without hope, without expectation, Without fantasy. I didn't play believing my life was going to change. I played as if it were an automatic, almost symbolic gesture, like someone who expects nothing, so as not to be disappointed. Therefore, when the money came, he found no room for celebration. He found a woman trained to be suspicious, trained to think, what if it ends? What if I lose? What if this isn't real? The prize didn't fall on neutral ground. It fell on decades of accumulated fear, on sleepless nights, on choices always made for the safest path, never the happiest one. That's when I understood something that hurt to admit. The money wasn't entering an empty life. I was entering a life full of scars. Scars that didn't appear out of nowhere. They were created little by little. Each time I stopped wanting. Each time I swallowed the desire. Each time I convinced myself that surviving was enough. I learned to live with less not only because I needed to, but because, at some point, I came to believe that it was all I deserved. And perhaps that's why, when the prize came, it didn't bring immediate joy. It brought confrontation. Confronting the woman I've become so I don't suffer anymore. Confronting everything I stopped experiencing for fear of losing. Confronting the question I never had the courage to ask, who would I be if fear weren't in control? Before winning the Mega Sena lottery, I thought the problem in my life was money. After winning, I realized the problem was much older and much deeper. I had learned how to survive, but I had never learned how to feel safe. Back then, before any awards, my life followed such a repetitive script that I hardly noticed the days passing. I would wake up early, always at the same time, even when there was no real urgency. My body didn't know how to rest. Resting seemed dangerous. Work occupied a good part of the day. It wasn't a bad job, but it wasn't something that gave me pleasure either. It was functional, secure, enough to pay the bills and keep everything under control, and for me, that was always more important than happiness. I used to constantly do mental calculations. At the supermarket, on the bus, at home. Before putting anything in my cart, I would calculate it. Before accepting a simple invitation, I would think about the cost. Not just the financial cost, but the emotional cost of overspending, of going beyond what I considered acceptable. My house was simple, organized, without excesses, nothing out of place, nothing that caught the eye. It wasn't negligence, it was control. I had habits that seemed like virtues to outsiders: frugality, discipline, planning. But inside, it wasn't organization, it was disguised fear. I avoided replacing furniture that was still usable. I postponed repairs. I only bought clothes when the old ones no longer fit. And even then, I chose the most basic ones, always thinking, I don't need that. People used to say I was simple, that I didn't care about luxury. And I agreed, because it was easier than explaining that, in reality, I didn't know how to handle comfort. At night, when I got home, the routine remained predictable. A simple dinner. The television was on more for company than for actual watching. News, soap operas, reruns, and every now and then, those news reports about people who won the lottery. Mega Sena, Queena, jackpot prizes. I watched without emotion. I didn't dream. I didn't create scenarios. I didn't allow myself to imagine. When someone would say, "Can you imagine winning a fortune like that?" I'd reply with a short smile, that's for a select few, and that concluded the matter. Because for me, dreaming has always been a risk. When you dream too much, the fall hurts more. Every week, almost out of habit, I placed a small bet. Always the same numbers. Not out of faith, not out of hope. It was almost an empty ritual. Like someone performing an ancient superstition without truly believing in it. I didn't even check the results carefully. Sometimes days would pass. That particular week, everything seemed the same. Nothing out of place. No strange feelings. No premonitions. I placed my bet as usual. I tucked the receipt into a corner of my bag. I forgot about it. I continued living the same way. With excessive caution. With silent fear. With the deep-seated certainty that stability was the most I could hope for in life. Until, a few days later, something broke that normality. It wasn't a grand announcement. It wasn't someone calling me. It wasn't a party. It was a silly detail. A conversation playing on television. A neighbor commenting on numbers. A random phrase that made me stop. "Did you see? The Mega Sena results are out. I listened without interest until they mentioned the numbers. And for a second, my body reacted before my head. A strange tightness in my chest, a rising heat. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was a coincidence, that those numbers looked like many others. But something wouldn't leave me alone. When I got home, I looked for the receipt. Not anxiously, but suspiciously. I opened the bag slowly, as if I were about to find something wrong. And I did. I checked it once, then again, then yet another time. And instead of joy, what followed was silence. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't tremble. My head didn't celebrate. I froze. The first thing I thought wasn't, my life has changed. It was, this can't be right. My whole body went on alert, as if something was out of control, as if I was about to lose something important. I sat down. I stood up. I sat down again. The television remained on, talking about numbers, values, dreams, but I couldn't hear properly. The money had arrived, but fear came along with it. At that moment, I understood something I couldn't yet explain in words. I wasn't ready to win, not because I didn't deserve it, but because I had spent my whole life learning how to lose. The routine that sustained me, the economy, the care, the restraint began to crumble from within, and instead of feeling free, I felt threatened. It was as if that prize was affecting something much deeper than my bank account. It was affecting the identity I had built to survive. And it was there, in that silent moment, without fireworks, without shouts, without hugs, that the real conflict began. Not with the world, but with myself. Because luck had knocked on my door, and I didn't know if I had the courage to open it. The official confirmation came a few days later, in a place I never imagined associating with my own story. A cold, overly bright room, with chairs lined up and a silence that seemed larger than the space itself. I went there accompanied because they told me it was better not to go alone. It's too much information, they said, but no one could have prepared me for what I felt. When the number was confirmed, when the amount appeared on the screen, when the employee pronounced those words with professional nonchalance as if she were talking about something commonplace, the world didn't erupt in joy. It shrank. Everything seemed too small for what was going on inside me. I heard phrases like, "Congratulations. That's the price. Now let's proceed with the formalities." But it seemed like they were talking about someone else. The money existed. It was real. It was there, proven, recorded. And even then, my body wouldn't believe it. While the people around me smiled, exchanged knowing glances, and whispered about possibilities, I felt a deep, almost physical discomfort. A tightness in my stomach, tension in my shoulders, as if something was about to go wrong. It wasn't joy I felt. It was vigilance. The first reaction wasn't to celebrate. It was to protect. Protect from whom? I didn't know yet, but I knew I needed to protect. On the way home, the journey seemed unreal. The streets were the same. People walked normally. The world continued as usual. And that confused me, because if everything was the same on the outside, why did I feel so different on the inside? The messages started coming in quickly. Phone calls. People who found out. Distant relatives. Acquaintances who never called. What a blessing. Now your life has changed. You deserve it. I rarely responded, with short sentences, with a restrained smile that no one saw on the other end of the line. Because, deep down, a question kept echoing. Where did he move to? That night, I didn't sleep. I lay down on the bed, closed my eyes, and the tiredness wouldn't come. My mind was making calculations that didn't make sense. I thought about everything that could go wrong. About scams, about losses, about mistakes. Money, which for so many represented freedom, for me represented risk. It was as if, suddenly, I had something too big to carry without drawing attention to it. And attention has always scared me. I remembered my childhood, when anything too good to be true came with a silent warning. This isn't for you. Don't get used to it. It could end. And now, there it was. A value that surpassed everything I had ever seen, touched, or imagined. But the old fear didn't know how to deal with it. In the following days, I realized something even more painful. I couldn't feel happiness without guilt. When someone said, "You can rest now," I thought, what if it ends? When they said, "Now you can buy whatever you want," the thought that came to mind was, What if I spent it wrong? The money was in the account, but I kept asking for permission to exist. There was a specific moment that marked me deeply. I went into a simple shop, one of those I always avoided because I thought it was superfluous. I looked at a small object, something I'd always wanted but never considered necessary. The price didn't make any difference now. Even so, I put it back in its place. My heart raced. My hands sweated. I left the store with the feeling of having escaped danger. It was there that something inside me finally broke. I realized that the number on the account didn't matter. I was still living as if I could lose everything at any moment. Money hadn't made me safe. It had left me exposed. And at that moment, a harsh truth began to take shape, still without clear words, but impossible to ignore. The prize wasn't freeing me. It was reopening an old wound. A wound made of scarcity, of fear, of years living with the feeling that nothing was permanent. People celebrated my good fortune, but I struggled with a feeling of internal invasion. It was as if the money had entered without asking permission, and found a house that was never prepared to receive it. In that first major emotional shock, I understood something that no one talked about when they dreamed of winning the lottery. Winning doesn't erase history, it amplifies it. And my story wasn't one of abundance, it was one of survival. I wasn't ready to live like a rich person, because, emotionally, I was still living like someone who needed to defend herself all the time. That night, sitting alone in the silent house, I cried, not from joy, from confusion, because I had everything I needed to be happy, and I couldn't be. It was at that point that I realized that money hadn't created a problem. It had only revealed what had always been there, hidden beneath the routine. The scar hadn't healed. It had been touched. And from that moment on, I knew the real conflict wouldn't be learning how to manage money. It would be learning to live without fear. In the days that followed, I tried to do exactly what everyone expected of me, to act as if nothing had changed. She woke up at the same time. She made the same coffee. She organized the house in the same way. From the outside, everything seemed the same. Inside, it was different. It was as if I were living in two different times. The present told me I was safe. The past screamed that it could all disappear at any moment. I avoided looking at my account balance. When I did, I felt a tightness in my chest, not relief. The number was too large for the woman I still was inside. I started to notice something terrifying. The more money I had, the more scared I felt. Fear of making mistakes, fear of trusting, fear of losing everything due to carelessness. I spent sleepless nights doing calculations that didn't need to be done. I thought about improbable scenarios, imaginary losses, tragedies that only existed in my head. My body couldn't keep up with the new reality. It continued to react as if I were still on the edge of the abyss. I tried to spend as little as possible. I bought only the essentials. Even simple things made me feel guilty. If I bought something a little better, the automatic question would come to mind. Did I really need this? If I thought about helping someone, another voice would chime in. What if you need help later? External abundance had not erased a scarcity mindset. It had only made it more evident. People would say, with the best of intentions, now you can live in peace. But I didn't know what that was like. Tranquility has always been something far removed from my reality. I learned to be alert, not at peace. I started avoiding conversations about the award. I would change the subject. I said I didn't like talking about it. Deep down, I was afraid to verbalize something I couldn't yet feel. One day a friend asked me, "Are you happy?" The question was simple, but it tore me apart inside. I answered yes, but the answer came out automatically. Empty, almost rehearsed. After she left, I sat on the sofa and just stood there, trying to understand what was happening to me. I had spent my whole life thinking that happiness would come when money was no longer a problem. And now that it wasn't, why was I still so tense? It was at this point that the guilt began to surface strongly. Guilt for not being happy. Guilt for not feeling enough gratitude. Guilt for seeming ungrateful for something so many people dreamed of. I kept telling myself, you should be celebrating. You should be enjoying yourself. You should be happy. But the word should didn't produce any feeling at all. I felt broken in a new way. It was no longer the pain of lack. It was the pain of not knowing how to receive. Gradually, I began to remember things from my childhood that I had never connected with before. I remembered the times I saw my parents worried about money, the whispered conversations, the difficult choices, the constant fear of running out. I remembered promises made in hushed tones: when we can afford it, we'll buy it. When things get better, we'll do it. And it almost never got better. I grew up learning that comfort was fleeting, that security was illusory, that anything good could be taken from me without warning. This schedule had never been revised. It had only been pushed forward. Now that the money is readily available, this plan has come into conflict with reality. My body didn't know how to relax. My mind didn't know how to trust. I began to realize how much I had survived my entire life, and how surviving is very different from living. There was one particularly difficult moment. I received a simple invitation, a short trip, nothing extravagant, something I'd always wanted to do, but never considered possible. This time, it was possible. Totally. Even so, I refused. She said it wasn't the right time, that she was tired, that she would leave it for later. But the truth was different. I didn't feel entitled to enjoy it. After hanging up the phone, I felt a deep sadness, not because of the trip itself, but because of the realization. I had spent years dreaming of freedom, and when it arrived, I didn't know what to do with it. That's when the fall deepened. I started questioning everything. Had I spent my whole life waiting for something that wouldn't solve what truly hurt me? Had I placed a responsibility on money that wasn't its own? I realized that the award had shattered an important illusion, that simply changing external conditions was enough to cure internal problems. The pain I felt now wasn't new. It had simply lost its disguise. Before, I used to say it was tiredness, worry, responsibility. Now, without those excuses, the stark truth remained. I lived in fear. Fear of losing, fear of making mistakes, fear of not deserving it. I found myself thinking about everything I missed out on because of this fear. Decisions I didn't make, doors I didn't open, dreams that remained hidden because it wasn't safe. And at that moment, a question began to form, slowly and heavily. If money didn't take away this fear, what will? It was painful to admit that the fall wasn't about losing something. It was about realizing how hurt I was. I wasn't experiencing financial hardship. I was experiencing emotional hardship, and it hurt in a different way, more quietly, more deeply. I cried alone, several times, not because I regretted winning, but because I realized that I was still carrying a version of myself that lived in fear, even when I no longer needed to. I understood, with cruel clarity, that poverty had left marks that money couldn't automatically erase. She had shaped my reflexes, my thoughts, my reactions. And now, without the urgency of survival, all those marks were exposed. It was there, deep down in that initial reaction, that I accepted something important. I needed to look at that scar. Ignoring it wasn't working anymore. Pretending everything was okay wasn't going to get me anywhere. The prize had given me options, but I would only have true freedom if I learned to deal with the fear that came with it. At that point, I still didn't know how to do it. But I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal anymore. The fall had happened, and for the first time, I understood that it wasn't a failure. It was a calling. A call to confront something I've spent my entire life avoiding. Because if I didn't confront this now, I could have all the money in the world and continue living like someone who expects to lose everything at any moment. The moment didn't come like an explosion. It came small, almost banal. It was a simple situation, one of those that nobody considers worthy of a life-changing event. I was in a store, nothing luxurious, nothing extravagant, something that now I could afford without thinking twice. The saleswoman was kind and patient. She showed me options. She talked about quality, comfort, and durability. I heard everything and automatically replied, "No, no need. This one is already good." The sentence just came out on its own, like it always does. But at that moment, something inside me stopped. Because it wasn't true. I wasn't choosing that because it was enough. I was choosing it because it was what I've always chosen. The minimum that doesn't draw attention, the minimum that doesn't provoke guilt, the minimum that doesn't seem too daring. I could afford the best. I could choose calmly. I could think about comfort, not just the price. Even so, My body reacted as if I were about to make a serious mistake. My heart raced. My breath became short. A familiar tightness gripped my chest. That's when I understood. It wasn't the money that changed. It was me who didn't keep up with the change. At that moment, I clearly saw something that had been developing for days. The prize hadn't created a new woman. It had only shed light on the woman I had always been. A woman trained for lack. A woman shaped by scarcity. A woman who learned to distrust her own security. I left the store without buying anything. I sat in the car and stayed there for a while, stopped, with my hands on the steering wheel. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. She was lucid. For the first time, I wasn't trying to justify what I felt. I was looking directly at it. I won the mega cena lottery, but I continued living like someone who could lose everything tomorrow. This sentence formed in my mind with disconcerting clarity. I began to mentally review several recent situations. The times I avoided spending. The opportunities I turned down. The invitations I postponed. None of that was prudence. It was fear. An ancient, deep, silent fear. The fear of trusting that something good could last. The fear of relaxing and being caught off guard. The fear of believing that, this time, it wasn't temporary. I realized that my relationship with money had always been one of vigilance, never of partnership. I didn't see him as a tool. I saw him as something that could betray me. And this had been going on long before the award. It came from the nights I missed, from the difficult choices, from the not now, maybe later, when I can. It stemmed from the constant feeling that any stability was too fragile to be celebrated. I grew up learning not to trust continuity. Everything was temporary. Everything could end. That logic stuck with me. And now, with all that money, she hasn't disappeared. She's intensified. Because losing a lot hurts more than losing a little. And I didn't know how to cope with the possibility of losing something so significant. It was at this point that awareness of the scar became inevitable. I wasn't reacting to the present. I was reacting to the past. My body was still living in the same survival narrative, even when reality said otherwise. I began to understand why I couldn't celebrate, why I froze, why the joy didn't come as everyone expected. Joy implies security, and I've never truly felt secure. I realized something harsh. I had always associated security with constant surveillance. If I relaxed, something would go wrong. If I trusted, something would be lost. If I believed too much, something would be taken away. This kind of planning can't be undone with money. It can be undone with awareness. And that's what that moment brought me. It wasn't a fault. It wasn't a shame. It was understood. I finally managed to name what I was feeling. Fear of not deserving it. Fear that it was all a mistake. Fear that at any moment, someone would appear saying there had been an error. Fear that the comfort was a trap. I realized that, deep down, I still saw myself as that woman who needed to constantly prove that she was responsible, thrifty, and caring. As if any gesture of pleasure were a risk. As if rest were carelessness. As if enjoyment were recklessness. It was there that I accepted something important, albeit painful. The scar wasn't about money. It was about identity. I had spent my entire life defining myself as someone who endures, who manages, who doesn't need anything, and now, suddenly, that identity was no longer needed. But it continued to operate. I didn't know who I was without scarcity. She had been my anchor for so long that, without her, I felt lost. The prize had solved a huge part of my life, but it had also opened up an inner void. An emptiness that could only be filled with something I had never practiced: confidence, trust in the present, trust in the future, trust in myself. I began to understand that my difficulty wasn't spending money. It was allowing myself to feel secure. Safety without surveillance. Safety without blame. Safety without constant fear of falling. That was terrifying. Because it's easier to live on high alert than to learn to relax after a lifetime of tension. Relaxing requires courage. It requires unlearning. That day, I sat by myself and silently admitted, I'm hurt. And there is no shame in admitting it. I didn't need an audience. I didn't need a speech. I just needed to stop pretending that money had solved everything. He didn't solve it. He revealed it. It revealed a strong woman, yes, but also one tired of just surviving. It revealed someone who needed to learn, for the first time, how to live without fear of falling. The awareness of that scar didn't heal me instantly, but it put me on the right path. Because when you understand where fear comes from, it stops controlling you in the dark. It becomes something that can be looked at, cared for, and worked on. I didn't emerge from that day transformed, but I did emerge honest with myself. And that honesty was the beginning of something that no amount of money had been able to buy until then. Clarity. I finally understood that the real change wasn't financial. It was emotional, and that, if I wanted to enjoy what I had gained, I would first need to learn to let go of what had held me back for so many years. The scar was there, exposed, recognized, and for the first time, I didn't want to hide it. I wanted to understand her, because only then could I, one day, stop living like someone who expects to lose everything, and start living like someone who believes they can stay. Nothing changed overnight, and that was the first thing I needed to accept. After that realization, after acknowledging, in no uncertain terms, that money hadn't healed my scar, I didn't wake up different. I didn't become a different person. I didn't start spending freely, nor did I immediately begin sleeping peacefully. What changed was more subtle. I stopped fooling myself. Before, I used to tell myself that I was prudent, that I was responsible, that I was just careful. Now I knew the truth. It was fear. And when you give fear a name, it loses some of its power. I started small, very small. It wasn't by buying expensive things. It wasn't by traveling. It wasn't by moving house. It was allowing me to sit without guilt, allowing me to choose without haste, allowing me to say yes without mentally calculating all the possible catastrophes. I began to observe my thoughts as one observes someone who talks too much. Every time that voice came up saying, "What if it ends? What if it goes wrong? What if you regret it?" I breathed. And I answered, in silence, "Today is not over. Today everything is here." At first, it seemed like a lie. It seemed irresponsible. It even seemed dangerous. But little by little, something inside me began to understand that security doesn't come from absolute control. It comes from repeated trust. Confidence that I can handle whatever comes. Confidence that I am no longer that helpless woman I once was. Confidence that the world is not a constant trap. I realized I'd spent my whole life thinking that surviving was the most I could achieve. Now, I needed to learn something much harder: how to persevere, to remain in comfort without guilt, to remain in stability without vigilance, to remain in the present without fleeing into fear of the future. I started sleeping better, not because the money was there, it had always been there, ever since the prize, but because my mind slowly began to let its guard down. The nights were no longer filled with calculations. The thoughts became less aggressive. There was still apprehension. There was still distrust. But there was no more panic. And that, for me, was huge. I also needed to reevaluate my relationship with helping others. Before, helping was almost a silent obligation, a way to justify my existence, a way to continue putting myself second. Now, I've started helping without losing myself. I learned to say no when something was too much for me. I learned to help without feeling guilty afterward. I learned to recognize that generosity doesn't require constant sacrifice. Something else changed. I started making plans. Not grandiose plans, achievable plans. Before, planning was daunting because it implied continuity, and I never trusted continuity. Now, I've started with simple things: a date, a commitment, something for a few months from now. And when those plans came to fruition, something inside me reorganized itself. See? Nothing collapsed. Each of these small confirmations was like a new brick being laid where before there was only fear. I didn't become a carefree person. I didn't become someone who thinks money solves everything. But I've stopped being someone who lives expecting the worst. Rebuilding wasn't about learning how to spend. It was about learning how to feel secure. Security without rigidity. Security without internal punishment. Security without that constant feeling that something good always comes with a price to pay later. I began to understand that my trauma wasn't weakness. It was adaptation. It was the way I found to survive when nothing was guaranteed. But now, that adaptation no longer served me. And abandoning an old strategy hurts, because, however burdensome it may be, it's what kept us alive. I needed to honor the woman who learned to live with little, without despising her, without denying her. But I also had to tell her, thank you. Now let me take care of it. This internal dialogue was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Because it's much easier to continue on autopilot than to change one's own emotional foundation. But gradually, the rigidity gave way to something new. A timid confidence, still insecure, but real. I realized that wealth isn't about spending without thinking. Wealth is about not living in a constant state of alert. And I only started building this when I stopped pretending that everything was already resolved. Today, I still carry the scar. It hasn't disappeared, but she no longer controls all of my decisions. She became a memory, not a command. I didn't need to erase the past to move on. I just needed to stop living as if it were still happening. The reconstruction was about this, not becoming another person, but allowing the person who always existed to breathe without fear. And for the first time, I was able to feel something that no amount of money had ever given me before. Tranquility. Not that excited, exaggerated tranquility of someone who thinks everything is solved, but the mature tranquility of someone who knows they can handle whatever comes. I didn't win this feeling in the lottery. I won it when I faced my scar head on, and I understood that true wealth wasn't in the prize, but in the freedom of no longer living as a prisoner of fear. That's where the reconstruction began. For a long time, I thought money was the answer to everything. Not because I was greedy, but because the lack of it had shaped every piece of my fear. When you spend years counting pennies, when you grow up hearing that everything can end suddenly, when you learn to protect yourself even before you want to, money becomes synonymous with emotional security. But life has taught me something I never learned in times of scarcity. Money changes circumstances. It doesn't heal wounds. It can pay bills. It can open doors. It can alleviate external pressures. But it doesn't erase memories. It doesn't silence inner voices. It doesn't undo habits created for survival. I had to win a lot to understand that the deepest scar wasn't in my bank account, it was inside me. And perhaps you, who are listening to this now, understand exactly what I'm talking about. Perhaps your fear isn't a lack of money. Perhaps it's a lack of love, a lack of time, a lack of recognition, a lack of solid ground to stand on. Perhaps you've achieved things you dreamed of, but you continue living as if you're about to lose everything. And that's tiring. That's burdensome. That's what makes you sick. We grow up believing that happiness comes after some kind of achievement, after money, after stability, after success. But sometimes all of this comes to an end, and happiness doesn't recognize the way back. Because she wasn't blocked by what was lacking on the outside. She was trapped by what hurt inside. That's why I learned in the most unexpected way possible that thriving isn't about accumulating. It's about allowing. Allow yourself to feel safe. Allow yourself to rest. Allow yourself to be in the present moment. And most importantly, to allow oneself to look at one's own scars without shame. If you've gained something important in life and yet still feel empty, if you've achieved stability and still live on edge, if you have more than you ever had, but less peace than you imagined, know this. You're not wrong. You just haven't healed everything yet. And that's okay. Healing is not about forgetting. It's about ceasing to obey fear as if it were absolute truth. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with 2 questions not to answer quickly, but to keep in mind. If everything you strive to achieve came true today, what within you would still prevent happiness? What old fear continues to guide new decisions? If this story touched you in any way, if it resonated with any memory, if it ignited something you had never put into words before, comment, share, follow the channel. Because here we don't just talk about money, success, or external achievements. Here we talk about what no one sees, the scars that continue to hurt, even when everything seems to be fine. And perhaps by telling my story, I can help you see yours with more kindness.